Have you ever wondered how we got to the point that we are in church history? And if you've ever heard anybody talking about the fact that we might be getting really close to the rapture, as in a rapture window time frame, then you're going to want to stay tuned for this video as myself and Pete Garcia get into some really interesting topics today. Welcome to Certainty for Uncertain Times. My name is Lauren, and the entire goal behind my channel is to help you navigate through the clown world, the chaos, and the dumpster fire that we all find ourselves living in these days through the lens of the Bible, and specifically with a lens towards Bible prophecy. Because you know what? It's happening in and around you, whether you know it or not. Now, if you've been looking to dive into the Bible's prophetic puzzle pieces, then you know what? You're in the right place, and I'm going to ask that you subscribe, hit the like button, and the notification bell for this channel so that you don't ever miss an upload from me. And hey, if you're getting the nudge to help support this channel, I've got links where you can do that below. Thank you to everybody who has done that so far. I truly could not be doing what I'm doing and trying to ramp up things on this channel without the support of you guys. Thank you so much. On this episode of Voices of Certainty, I had the incredible opportunity to sit and chat with none other than Pete Garcia. And if you are in the Bible prophecy following world, then you know who exactly Pete is. Pete has been on some of the big stages, if you will, of the prophecy conferences that go on all over the country and outside of the country. I know he's been to plenty of other countries as well, Australia this past year. Pete is really sought after for everybody's YouTube channel because he's just got an incredible knowledge of church history. He's got a huge military background. His brain is just massive, and he withholds so much information in it and can just kind of like spit fire, just rapid fire is probably the right word, on any topic that you ask him about. Now, I think about a year ago, Pete and I met somehow through social media. I think it all time runs together these days. But I was so honored. He invited me onto his channel at that time, and I got the chance to go interview on Pete's channel, and we answered a ton of questions that people had about, Bible prophecy, the rapture, all that stuff. And so I was so excited and elated to have Pete come on my channel this time and chat through a few things in regards to early church history, especially in light of the fact that I'm still working on this series, debunking the myths that surround John Darby. And then, of course, one of my favorite videos of all time, and I actually watch this video at least once a year, is a video that Pete did with Tyler from Generation 2434, all on this topic called the Final Four. And this topic is basically talking about how we're getting to the end of the church age and how we can look at that through history, and that the year 2023, which has already passed us by, 24, 25, and 26 are really just high times of paying attention to what's going on in the world. And Pete and I discussed that. So of course, as always, anything that we talked about, anything that we reference, I'll have a ton of links down for you below, along with where you can find Pete. If you are an avid reader, go subscribe to Pete's blog. You will learn so much from his website, Rev310. I have learned so much from Pete. He's an incredible writer. He does videos every single week on his channel. Go subscribe to his channel. There's truly just not many guys out there better than Pete Garcia, and I'm so honored to have this opportunity to be able to interview him today on these topics that are really fun to talk about. So I hope you enjoy this interview. Well, hey, Pete Garcia, officially welcome to Voices of Certainty, this segment that I'm doing on my channel now, where people come on who have so much knowledge on theology, eschatology, current events, all the things. And I'm so excited to have you as a guest today. I know I've told you this before, but your work personally has changed my life. And I'm just so thankful for so many of you guys in the field who have just accepted the mission that God has put you guys on. And all these years later, it's affecting people like myself. So thank you so much. So before we get started into the topics today, I would love for you to talk a little bit about who you are, your work, where you want people to find you, and then we can kind of dive into the topics that we're going to chat about today.
All right. Well, as you noted, my name is Pete Garcia, the founder and editor for rev310.net. That's my primary website. Began writing back in 2011 with the Omega Letter, and I stayed with them for about 7 years until they closed the website down in 2018. I never run my own website, so I kind of was experimenting with different things and different platforms and stuff, but I ended up settling with rev310.net on the Wix platform. And a couple of years after that, because I'd been doing so much writing and interviews at this point on channel around 2021 or 20
Oh, did we lose you? Hey, Pete, are you there? Oh,
interviews with various guest hosts, and I've done a few conferences, spoke at a few conferences, and then continue to do my weekly articles and then some short stories and other things that and artwork for the website. So
very cool. Awesome. Well, your work is amazing. And I've seen you obviously on so many of our favorite people on their platforms, whether, it's Lee or JB or any of those guys, Tyler. And so you and I would kind of talked about going through a couple things today, because obviously I'm doing this giant series right now, debunking the myth that John Darby created the rapture. And we've been going through a lot of church history in this particular series. And what I wanted to do, the goal of it was to just walk people through church history from the very early church all the way up to John Darby, proving that, again, this concept of the rapture, this whole idea of rescue before judgment has been taught all along. And so one of the things that you and I had chatted about was addressing church history knowledge. And I can't recall where I heard you go into such detail on the church and how we kind of got to where we are today. But I feel like it was JB's show. I feel like it was one of your first interviews with JB Hickson, and you just dove into all of this church history that I just was like, wow, this is amazing. So I was wondering if you could drop some knowledge on everybody today about church history and just kind of how we went from the early church to where we are now and being Protestant and all of that.
all right, well, certainly I'll do kind of the summarized view, and then I can expand it out a little bit
Cool.
into various topics or to particular people. But I mean, largely what we need to recognize is that first and foremost, that John Darby did not create dispensationalism
No.
out of nothing. You know, he didn't
Right.
speak it ex cathedra. It was something. It was an idea that's been prevalent going back to the first century,
Mm-hmm.
and even before then. There's certainly Jewish ideas of that mankind's time on the earth would mirror the creation days of the days of the week that we see in Genesis chapter 1.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea that the world is broken up into periods of time is not unique to John Darby. And I think one of the chief criticisms that come against Darby really isn't so much for dispensationalism as it is for the pre-tribulation rapture, which kind of gets lumped in there with him.
Yep.
But I think first and foremost, we need to, just as a general understanding, to understand that the first 3 centuries of the church, the early church fathers, these would be those folks prior to the Council of Nicaea in 325, were largely premillennial and
Mm-hmm.
and to an extent pre-tribulational in
Yes.
their understanding of the rapture. Now, um, certainly there's some misunderstandings or misquoting of fathers on both sides, um, in their understanding of was the tribulation 3.5 years or was it seven
Or was it
years? But they
7?
saw
Right.
this as a deliverance prior to God pouring out His wrath on the earth.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so we have that the early church was predominantly premillennial. They believed
Mm-hmm.
that Christ would return and set up His kingdom on the earth. This view would not uh, really go as far as the predominant view in Christendom. It wouldn't really go beyond the fourth century, because around that time is when Augustine came out, and with his City of God book, and basically that became the from a doctrinal standpoint, a lot of those ideas and things became codified into what would become later the Roman Catholic Church, the system of the Roman Catholic Church, and a lot of those
Right.
beliefs
Yep.
of amillennialism. So amillennialism was not part of the early church. It's not part of the Bible. It is simply something that came about centuries later, uh, due to some other geopolitical factors that had been going on at that time. Largely the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the Jewish nation, and the spreading out of the gospel, the legalization of Christianity within the Roman Empire, and so forth. So
Hmm.
a lot of factors begin to come into play here, into how things became shaped. But the early church was premillennial, to a
Hmm.
large part pre-tribulational. They viewed the world in a dispensational manner, that God is
Yes.
dealing with mankind in different stages.
Hmm.
And we see the rapture in particular in shadow and type in the Old Testament, and then we see it in type in the written word itself in the New Testament as it's unveiled to the Apostle Paul. We
Hmm.
see it in the foreshadowing, for example, with uh, Enoch being raptured, caught up in the
Yes.
in Genesis chapter 5.
Yep.
Nobody knows what happened to him. We get an explanation later on in Hebrews 11
Yep.
that he was taken alive into heaven.
Yep.
And same thing with Elijah. He is
Hmm.
caught up, not by a chariot of fire. The chariot of fire separates him from Elisha, but he is
Hmm.
essentially caught up at that point too.
Yep.
And we see it in in terms of typology. We can see that in examples that Jesus gives us in Luke 17 of Noah and Lot, that they were delivered prior to God's judgment being poured out upon the earth. And even that question, the conversation, will the God of heaven do what's right? In
Mm.
other words, this is a question that Abraham was asking him on the plains of Mamre, that he's trying to bargain for the lives of the people that he knows in Sodom and Gomorrah. He knows they're
Hmm.
about to be destroyed. He goes, starts at 50, and he starts working his way down. He gets down to
Yeah.
10, and that's why Lot was, and his family was delivered out of there, because there wasn't even 10 righteous people in those two cities. So
Right.
um interestingly, the angels that are delivering Lot that night tell him that they have to hurry because they can't do anything
They
until he's
can't.
moved
Right.
out of the way.
Yep.
So those aren't raptures per se, neither him nor Noah,
Hmm.
but they are deliverances prior to God's wrath being poured out. So God knows how to save his own
Hmm.
from the hour of testing that he pours out upon. Back then it was the world in Noah's day, and in Lot's day, it was specific to Sodom and Gomorrah, to a geographic location. And then
Yeah.
here again at the end, we're going to see that this tribulation, this great tribulation, is going to be poured out upon the entire earth, and there's nowhere to escape from it except to be
No.
removed from the earth prior to it.
Right. Which
Um,
piggybacks off your verse that you have as your main tagline, Rev 310, that we will be kept from the hour of trial. And I think that's a lot of pushback that I get to, and I know you get it, obviously, but that um Noah was kept through the flood, right? And there, I just don't think people understand the difference, that in order to be kept from something, you have to be kept from something. Like, it seems pretty logical to just say it that way, but a lot of people really try to overcomplicate it. In that verse, I feel like is really a rapture proof text for us. Like, that is a very strong verse, Rev 310. That
yeah.
we don't, we're not going to go through the 7 years of tribulation when God does pour out his wrath by obviously releasing the Antichrist. And I think the other thing that is interesting about that concept too is that we also get we get told all the time, and this is where I can always tell that somebody is just regurgitating information that they're hearing from other people that are against pre-tribulational people. But we get called escapists all the time, and it just baffles me how somehow people are putting words into our mouths that we're going to escape things that are hard. I have never thought that we are going to escape things that are hard. We're going through hardship right now. I don't, my life has not been easy for the last 4 years for sure. But the only thing that we are promised out of is that 70th week, that final 7 years from the time that tribulation starts, when the Antichrist signs that covenant. That time frame Christians are exempt from. I don't think people quite get that if we go through that, it's like the wrath is being poured out on Jesus all over again. Does that
Yeah,
make logical sense? Am I on the right
yeah,
track there in that thinking?
yeah. That's almost exactly why Moses was punished for striking a rock the second time when he wasn't told to strike it. If Christ is the picture of the rock, he was
Mm,
only meant to be struck once for our
yeah.
iniquities.
Yes.
And here is many of these different views, whether it's the pre-wrath, the
Yes.
mid-trib, the post-tribulation view, these multiple rapture views.
Hmm.
Um, the reason that their typology is all wrong is that they have, you know, Moses striking a rock the second time and
Yes.
validating it being the correct view when God said, no, that's not what's going to happen.
Right.
Um, because we are sealed by the Holy Spirit, we are joined into the universal body of Christ,
Yes.
and that's what connects all of the church age believers from the first Pentecost until the rapture, is
Yes.
that we are all brought in as one particular body. We're corporate in the sense that we're all over the world for the last 2,000 years, but we're
Hmm.
singular in the sense that we're tied in with one body,
Hmm.
who is the body of Christ. And when we see in Revelation chapter 5 that Jesus is the one that begins, he's the only one found worthy to open up the judgments, to take the scroll from the right hand of the Father, and then to begin to open the seals, which begins the judgments upon the earth.
Hmm.
I mean, it's clear as day. It's Jesus who is the one who is initiating all of the things that will happen. And
Yes.
somehow pre-wrath folks and mid-trib and post-trib have conflated this and obfuscated this idea that the first six seals are not really wrath. They're the wrath of Satan or the wrath of man. And clearly Revelation 5 clearly
It states that. Yeah.
identifies who is responsible for this judgments. And the seal judgments aren't going to be a walk in the park either. I mean,
No.
a quarter of the world's population is going to die.
Right.
By today's standard, that's somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 billion people. And if
Yeah.
you
I
look at
mean,
all the wars that have ever been fought, all the wars that have ever been fought that we've had record of, you're talking about 500 million people have died in all those wars in thousands of years. And here in just a very short period of time, 2 billion people are going to die.
yeah. Wow. I know it's a
It's
lot.
mind-boggling,
Hmm.
the amount of carnage that's going to be unleashed upon the world. People can't reconcile it.
Hmm.
So, but
And I also
um,
don't think people get that they're, that when those seals start to open, like you just said, those are not going to be a walk in the park. They're not, the
yeah.
disasters, the just it's. I think it's hard to even comprehend that type of judgment.
Mm, yeah.
So anyway, go ahead. You were going to say something. Go ahead.
Well, so let me give an overview of the early church, and I mean the
Go for
first
it.
3 centuries. So they had an imminent, they had the return of Christ was imminent in their mind,
Yes.
that they believed that he could come in their generation, and we see that language in Paul's epistles when he includes himself in that
Yep.
um, earnest belief that the Lord will return in his lifetime. Secondly, they had a millennial view, that they were Chiliast, in the sense that this Chiliasm, or this 1,000 years that we see in Revelation 20, is largely on their mind, in the sense that they believe that Christ had to return to establish the kingdom.
Hmm.
They didn't think that this was something that the church was going to do.
Right.
And by 70 AD, the nation of Israel had been sacked by the Romans and basically scattered to the four corners. And we'd see this a second time in 135 AD under Emperor Hadrian. So the first time was under Emperor, I want to say it was Vespasian. And then the second time, 135 AD, was really a 3-year siege again on Jerusalem to quell the Bar Kokhba revolt. And that saw the ultimate dispersion of the Jews for the next
Yes.
what we'd call almost 2,000 years, the diaspora.
Yes.
And Simon Bar Kokhba was this Messiah. People were propping him up as a Messiah figure, that he would militarily defeat the Romans and
Mhm.
restore Jerusalem back to the Jewish people. And I think just prior to that, what triggered all that was the Romans had attempted to rename Jerusalem Aelia Capitolina, and they were going to reconstruct the temple on top of where the Temple Mount had been, the second temple had been, and they were going to put a temple and dedicate it to Jupiter, and that sparks this second revolt. And anyway, so that gets squashed. Now, if you're a Christian living in Greece, or Samaria or some other place in the Roman Empire at this time, and now Jerusalem has ultimately been crushed. I mean, it was crushed the first time, destroyed, sacked. 1 million Jews were killed, according to
Mhm.
Josephus. All of those things that happened. And then the second time here in 135 AD, you would be thinking, well, God is done with the Jewish people. Like,
Oh,
you know,
absolutely.
they are getting what they deserve because they crucified our Lord,
Yep.
et cetera, et cetera.
Yep.
And also remember that Bibles weren't prevalent at this time. And most people couldn't even read.
Right.
So you had certain peoples that would, whether they were part of the Sanhedrin that would read from the Old Testament, what we'd call the Old Testament, or even the letters that were circulating in the first century from the apostles, people were still trying to piece together how this was all supposed to play out. I mean, even in Acts chapter 1, after the resurrection of Christ, we see the disciples, you know, asking, Lord, are you at this time going to restore the
Mhm.
kingdom to
Mhm.
Israel? They're not asking when he's coming back a second
No.
time. They're thinking he's okay, he's resurrected now. Now
Yes.
he's going
He
to
can be the
start doing
king.
all these things.
Right.
Yeah. So you know, we're looking back on hindsight, and it's easy for us to pick them apart and everything they've said, or you know, or didn't say, or didn't know. But you got to put it in the context of their day. They're trying to wrap their minds around what's going on in their world at that time. So
Yeah.
the beauty of the Bible is that it's written from a God who is not bound by time. So he, you know, God is
Mhm.
eternal. He's omnipotent, omnipresent,
Mhm.
omniscient. He's not confounded and confined by the constructs of time that we have. Our
Mhm.
time is linear. We go from, you know, the time we're born all the way up until the time we die, and it's always in one direction. Where God exists outside of that, and he's able to look at the end of the beginning at the exact same time. And that's why when he narrates the Bible, some of it, uh, especially for the early church, and we're trying to look at the early church fathers and pick their brain on what they thought on certain topics. On
Right.
certain topics, they would get things absolutely correct. On other things, they
Yep.
would completely blow it. You know, because
Right. It's
again,
so true.
they're trying to wrap their minds, so they're not infallible. They're just it's
Mhm.
interesting to look at what they're saying because it gives us the mindset of that time period. So they were largely premillennial the first three
Yep.
centuries. They believed in a 1,000 year kingdom, so they're Achilleist.
Mhm.
Um, they believed in a resurrection of the dead. They believed in a
Yep.
final judgment. They believed in a new heaven and a new earth. They
Yep.
believed in a time that would be a great trial and tribulation,
Yep.
unlike the world had ever seen, and that was future to them. They were largely united on opposing things like the Judaizers, and on the Jewish side, the people that were trying to bring Christian converts back under the law,
Mhm.
and on the other side, on the pagan side, they were trying to stave off all of these attacks from the Gnostics, who began to introduce a whole bunch of
Oh,
Gnostic writings and try and
yes.
pass it off as legitimate.
Yes.
So they had their hands full in the first three centuries. The establishing perfect eschatology was not high, I don't think, on their priority in terms of the things that they were having to contend with at the time. And then on
Absolutely.
top of that, they had hostile emperors. You know, not every emperor was hostile, Roman Empire, but some of them, you know, at least 10 were very hostile and began these great purges
Mhm.
that began with Nero and ended with
Mm.
Diocletian in the third century.
Right.
And so different churches and different communities were contending with all of these different things, and the fragments and the pieces of material that we have that have survived the annals of time point to these kind of overarching mindsets of the early church, the first three
Mhm.
centuries of the church, that they were premillennial in their view. They believed in a literal 1,000 year kingdom. They
Yep.
believed in the resurrection of the dead. They believed in the final judgment. They believed that there would be this time of great, in the future, a great tribulation that unlike the world had ever seen. They began to differentiate between apocalyptic literature like the Apocalypse of Peter versus the Apocalypse of John. In the
Mhm.
Apocalypse of John, they said we can read those in the churches, but not the Apocalypse of Peter. And they did not consider that to be canon, or you know, divinely inspired. And so that basically sums up the first kind of three centuries. But I want to dive in just a little bit in those because I want to look at some of the more specific things. So we have the death of Christ,
Yep.
I believe, in the year 33 AD.
Same here.
So you would have the death, burial, and resurrection, plus the 40 days they were told to remain
Yep.
on top of the other 10 days they'd already been there. So they're waiting for the first Pentecost.
Yep.
We have basically the Gospels and the epistles, all of the writings start to begin somewhere around 48 AD up through John being the last one, and that was in
Yep.
95 AD. on
Yep.
when he was imprisoned on the island of Patmos
Atmos. Yep.
by the
Mm-hmm.
Emperor Domitian.
Mm-hmm.
So Peter and Paul and John each had disciples of their own, right? Paul had a lot of folks that helped and aided him in his ministry.
Yep.
Titus, Timothy, and others, right? There's a
Mm-hmm.
bunch of ladies involved in this.
Yep.
But the ones that we consider like the early church fathers, you have under uh, Peter, for example, Clement of Rome was an
Yep.
early church father, and then under Peter was Ignatius of Antioch. We had really from John, since he's the last disciple that's alive and lives the longest and doesn't die a martyr's death. We know that he had disciples, the disciples of the apostles, so that he had underneath him, he had a guy named Polycarp of
Yep.
Smyrna.
Mm-hmm.
I think he was a bishop of Smyrna. And under him, we had Irenaeus, and then
Yep.
under Irenaeus, you had guys like Justin Martyr,
Yep.
Tatian, Clement of Alexandria, Hippolytus, and so on and so forth. So there's in the military, we had a thing called the chain of custody. So
Okay.
if a senior leader gave me a document, I would have to sign for this document. And then I would hand carry this document to the person that it was supposed to go to. And if that person wasn't available, I had to have somebody that was a representative for him or her to sign for that document to say that they received it. And then I can take that back and say, look, this message has been delivered as promised. This is what we call a chain of custody. We see the chain of custody under about the Bible, in particular doctrines, not just eschatology, but doctrines on communion, on baptism, on the deity of Christ, on salvation by grace. All of these
Yes.
different things are we get to see these chains of custody begin to happen. So I look at the early church fathers as interesting to note what they're thinking at the time, and in particular to this argument that we're making here that
Mm-hmm.
Darby did not create all these things out of thin air in 1830, that these things
Mm-hmm.
have been in the church for a very long time.
Yes.
The idea of dispensationalism, that God works through in different ages and revealing himself to mankind a little bit here, a little bit there, and so on
Mm-hmm.
and so forth, as well as premillennial thought, and then the ultimately pre-tribulation rapture. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think it's interesting if you want to look at it from the big picture view. We have Jerusalem is sacked in 70 AD. They're sacked a second time by Hadrian in 135 AD. And then Jerusalem, the Jews are scattered at this point. They are no more. They exist only in the history books.
Yes.
And so there was a lot of confusion and a lot of early church fathers contending with this idea. Okay, so what do we do with all the promises to the Old Testament, to the Jewish people in the Old Testament? These are
Right.
promises that had been given by God to these people, yet
Yep.
they don't exist anymore in terms
Right.
of a political body or nation or whatever. And we start to see the rise of something called replacement theology. And this
Mm-hmm.
becomes increasingly popular, especially as Christianity becomes legalized within the broader framework of the Roman Empire. So we
Mm-hmm.
have Constantine converts to
Constantine.
Christianity in
Yep.
312. The Edict of Milan in 313 legalizes Christianity. The Council of Nicaea in 325 basically is contending against a certain cultic belief, Arianism. And then by 391, Theodius legalizes Christianity as the religion of Rome, the official religion of Rome.
Mm-hmm.
And by then you have Rome is split into two different cities, capitals. You have in the west Rome, and in the east you have Constantinople. And as the west begins to fall into decline and disrepair, and they're getting sacked by the Goths and the Visigoths and all these different barbarian groups,
Yeah.
Constantinople remains kind of the rising power in the area, and they end up becoming the Byzantine Empire.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly, there was a lot of Byzantine folks that were Christian that believed, because they followed the Septuagint timeline in terms of the chronologies of mankind, they believed that in the year 500 would be the 6,000th year. And so a lot of them began to believe they were the kingdom, the
Mm-hmm.
physical manifestation of the kingdom. And obviously, we're still here 1,500 years later, so obviously that can't be true. But
Right.
the Byzantines, they collapsed eventually under their constant attacks by the Ottoman Turks in 1452, I think, 1450. I had it written down somewhere. I want to say it was 1452, but
Okay.
they're conquered by the Ottoman Turks, and basically that whole area it becomes Turkish for the next 400 years.
Wow.
And so let me stop there for a second because I've
Okay.
covered like almost 2,000 years in just a few minutes.
Yeah, it's awesome.
There
It's
was
so awesome.
there's a lot of things that happened in between those major kind of milestones that helped shape Christian thought and Christian belief across Europe, Africa, eventually the Americas, and so forth. And you got to keep in mind too that Christianity, whereas in the early church time period, they're fighting against the Gnostics, they're fighting against the Judaizers. By the time the sixth century comes around, you've got the rise of Islam
Mm-hmm.
in the East, and that becomes the major conflict of the ages for like the next 1,000 years. It results in the Crusades, which were kind of they did the Crusades in response to the constant attacks by the Muslims, into Europe, going all the way back to like the time of Charlemagne in the 800s. So the Crusades were meant to like recapture the Holy Lands and re-Christianize all those places that had formerly been Christian, like Turkey, Syria, Egypt, and so forth, but had since converted by pain of death and the sword to Islam. They wanted to go back and reconvert all those. Now they did it in a military way. Of course, there's going to be victims. There's going to be atrocities because these are military contact conquests. There's not anything good that comes out of it. That's not how Christianity was meant to be spread. It was meant to be spread by sharing the gospel, the good news, and then that revelation to that individual when accepting it would become change from the inside out. And that's where that true change happens. It doesn't come from the point of a sword or a spear forcing people to convert. Those are
Mm-hmm.
all kind of false converts that we see throughout history, especially when we talk about the barbarians that convert to Christianity. They think because they're baptized, they're all of a sudden Christian at that point. So
Mm-hmm.
okay, so let's see. I wanted to mention just a handful of these documents that did bring up the idea of premillennialism, pre-tribulation, um, so as to say that these things are easily, I don't want to say easily searchable. It's not easy reading, but guys like Ken Johnson have come out and have
Yeah.
done books, the ancient church fathers, what the disciples of the apostles taught.
Mm-hmm.
And again, his research on it is very broad, not just on eschatology, but on every subject, papal
Mm-hmm.
authority, on predestination, baptism, etc., on a lot of different topics. What did these guys think about these things?
Mm-hmm.
So he does a good job in capturing that. Lee Brainerd has
Yeah.
got some great resources in his own research and in
Mm-hmm.
discovering texts that just taken at face value lead you to believe that in a pre-tribulation rapture that way predate uh, Darby. William C. Watson had a book called "The Dispensationalism Before Darby." From an academic standpoint, it goes way back, and so I think that there is this idea when people come out and say that they lead off with that argument that Darby created the rapture, that immediately screams to me like this person has not done any type of research
I
at
agree.
all
Yep.
on any of these things
Yep.
to make that kind of claim.
Mm-hmm.
Now, here's a couple. We have the Shepherd of Hermas was written about 150 AD, and it quotes in there Cyprian and then Ephraim the Syrian, and gives dreams and interpretations. And in 2.2-6, the church, the bride clothed in white, escapes the great tribulation because of the promise of the Lord. This is not considered scripture, but it does show. I'm quoting here from the book. It does show that the many second Christians believed in a pre-tribulation rapture.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the confusion then comes, okay, did they believe in a 7 year
Or
pre-tribulation
three and a
rapture, or
half.
was there or a three and a
Yes.
half year? And
Yes.
so
Well, and I've pointed out to people, even if they believed in a 3.5 year, let's just say that it's that's where they come from. That's not a mid-trib view because they
yeah,
didn't believe in the first 3.5 years. So they're still, if it started here, the church is still being removed before this point of wrath starts, even though they
yeah,
only believe in
they're
three and a
so
half years. That's the key. It's to capture there.
yeah, exactly. We have the Mauritanian canon fragment, which confirms revelation of scripture. That was in 175 AD, and while that doesn't specifically um, point to one direction or the other. It does differentiate between the book of Revelation, the Apocalypse of John versus the Apocalypse of Peter, which was considered what we look at now and say, okay, well that's a Gnostic gospel. That's not part of the canon, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the fact is that they consider that to be scripture. Irenaeus confirms. Remember, Irenaeus is a
Mm-hmm.
disciple of Polycarp. Polycarp's
Yep.
a disciple of John. Irenaeus confirms that the book of Revelation was given to John toward the latter end of the reign of Domitian. So that would have been in 95 AD.
95. Yeah.
Domitian dies in 96 AD. And so, in all of the things that we look at, if Revelation was written in 95 AD or given to John then it can't be about anything in the first century. It can't be about the destruction of Jerusalem, which is mentioned. It can't be about any of those things prior. This is future looking,
It's
saying this
future.
is going to happen in the future.
Yes.
So
Agreed. Yep.
about as far out in the first century as you could get without being outside of the first century by an apostle confirming everything that he's writing down as being from directly from God. It's this chain of custody. And then in the book of Revelation, God gives us this way to break the book down in chapter 1, verse 19, saying, write the things you've seen, which is chapter 1,
Yes.
the things which are, which is chapters 2 and 3, the churches.
Yep.
And
And the
then after
things
that,
which
the
are to
things which shall
come.
come after.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So these are our future events.
Yep.
Now, we have in Tertullian 207 AD against Marcion 5.16, and I'm quoting here. He says, he, in parentheses, Paul, says, those who remain until the coming of Christ, along with the dead in Christ, will rise first, being caught up in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. By the mouth of Isaiah, it was said long ago, quote, who are these who fly like clouds unto me, as doves with their young ones, question mark, and end quote. Um, Cyprian, the who I mentioned earlier with the Shepherd of Hermas, uh, also taught that believers would be delivered before the time of the Antichrist, and that in
Yep.
his treatise of Cyprian 21 through 26 and his Epistle 55. We have in 1260 AD, Brother Dulcino, who was the leader of
Yep.
the Apostolic Brethren, has writings that in pre-tribulation in nature.
Mm-hmm.
And I just included some of these other things here that were not specific to eschatology, but are unique to Christendom. So, like the Wycliffe Bible being created in 1371, so now it's being translated into English in a complete form. There were other English or Anglo-Saxon translations prior to that, going all the way back through the Dark Ages, but it wasn't a complete set like what Wycliffe did.
Yep.
1517, Martin Luther posted his 95 Thesis on the door in the Church of Wittenberg,
Yeah.
and sparking the Protestant Reformation.
Yep.
1525, William Tyndale's burned at the stake for translating the New Testament out of Greek to English. And then we have John Bale, who wrote the first English commentary on the Book of Revelation, sometime in the 1500s. I don't have a specific date on it. And then Joseph Mead, who is considered the father of premillennialism, wrote his Clavis Apocalypta in 1627, also arguing from a premillennial standpoint. Now, other things that kind of dovetail into this, when we mentioned the Protestant Reformation, well, the Catholics were not happy with the Protestant Reformation. Now, remember, Martin Luther wasn't trying to revolt against the Catholic Church. He was opening these things up as discussions at an academic level, trying to reform the Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm.
But instead, they, basically called them an anathema and cursed them, and basically said, "Hey, take that stuff down. We don't want any of this." Because he's calling into question things like the indulgences and
Yep.
purgatory and all these other Catholic
Yep.
things that are not in the Bible.
Right.
1611, the King James version is created, and so onward from him, there have been numerous well-known Protestant teachers, preachers who bring up the rapture, talk about it in a pre-tribulational sense of the understanding that we have. Let me try to see who some of the folks are. Morgan Edwards,
Mm-hmm.
James McKnight, Thomas Scott, John Askell, Philip Doddridge, John Gill, the 1600s, there's Peter Giroux. Also in the 1600s, Thomas Drakes, Barton Holiday, Ephraim Hewitt,
Hmm.
William Sherwin, Samuel Pietro. And so
All of those
just a
are
little bit of
pre-Darby.
research. Yeah, these are all before Darby.
I know.
So, so I think what we can honestly say is that the early church fathers, going back to the apostles themselves, were premillennial, and
Yes.
they were Chiliast in their understanding, and even to the point where Paul, who is given the revelation to reveal it, this mysterion, the mystery of the
Yep.
rapture, describes it as happening prior to. John confirms that. Jesus confirms that.
Hmm.
And then we see going forward from the apostles and from Jesus, the disciples of the apostles, for the most part, remained consistent in their premillennialism, consistent
Hmm.
in their pre-tribulational understanding, and
Hmm.
that goes up until about the 300s, when we start seeing these major shifts within the Roman Empire that stopped persecuting Christians and began to legalize Christianity. And really, from the years 300 to 400, there's this great merging of the church, not into the world, but of the world coming into the church, just like Jesus spoke of in the parable of the mustard seed. That this mustard seed, which a mustard bush is not that big, mustard tree is not very big, but in the example, it becomes huge, vastly massive, way bigger in monstrosity than it
Hmm.
normally would have. And in the context of the parable, we see the birds of the air beginning to take nest in the branches and stuff. And in the context of all of the mystery parables, mystery kingdom parables, the birds are a bad thing. They're a negative thing,
Hmm.
because they're the ones that went and ate up the seeds in the parable of the soils. So they're considered not a good thing. So the
Yep.
fact that they're nesting now in the tree that is supposed to be the church that spreads worldwide, is there's going to be this mixing of the wheat and tares together throughout until the end of time, when Christ does the separating. So that is the early church in a nutshell, what they believed, and we see that it begins to transform in the third century, or what I guess we'd call it the fourth century, the
Fourth
years
century.
300
Yeah.
through the 400s, when Christianity is legalized and then it becomes embraced by the emperors, and they convert their own temples to Christian temples, and then their own priests to Christian priests. And these guys are bringing in all sorts of baggage with them, right?
Hmm.
They're bringing in all these like rituals and the headdresses and uniforms
Hmm.
and things that they're doing. And we can look back in time and see how these things began to become practiced in what we call orthopraxy in the Roman Catholic system, like
Yep.
making the sign of the cross, became a thing in like the 500s, and we those things are time stamped as when they became like part of Catholic dogma. So I don't think that when people come at the pre-tribulation rapture view, simply saying that Darby created in 1830, that is a gross injustice to all the history that they're glossing over,
Very much
and
so.
not really wanting to take serious. And so, it's a tragedy, really, and I think it's
Hmm.
by design. Satan
A hundred
wanted
percent.
this obfuscated because he did not want the each generation to have this blessed hope. I mean, imagine
Yeah.
how different the world would be if every generation of Christians in the last 2,000 years have maintained this hope and this optimism, that they can't fix the world, but Christ can. But they're
Agreed.
still going out being busy about the Lord's work and making
Yeah.
disciples of all nations, and
Hmm.
being salt and light and wherever they are. So I think these other views, their main issues is that they confuse the church with Israel.
Yes.
They, which we go back to like the early church fathers. What do they do with the nation of Israel now that it no longer exists? And that's where this
Yep.
replacement theology starts to rise up,
Yep.
and we start to see this manifesting in certain documents from the early church fathers,
Hmm.
and they're confused on it. And so,
Yeah.
I guess the bottom line for me is that without Israel back in the land, it was almost impossible to know where you were on God's timeline, because
Absolutely.
The Old Testament prophecy saying that Israel would become a nation again
In
had
a
to
day.
happen in order to usher in the last days.
Yeah.
And the fact that Israel
Agreed.
wasn't a nation for
Yeah.
almost 2,000 years, it's no wonder
Hmm.
there was confusion as to where the people were on God's timeline. They had no idea.
Yeah.
It seemed almost absolutely impossible for Israel to become a nation again, given the fact that they're scattered amongst, so many different nations, and the
Hmm.
Ottoman Turks had been in place there for nearly 400 years. And so it would
Hmm.
take something like World War I and World War II to bring the world about, to bring Israel to become a nation again.
Well, and I think a lot of people, they really get hung up on who was involved with that. You've got the Rothschilds and people real. I mean, I've had arguments with people on that stuff, and I'm like, listen, no, the Rothschilds are not. They're there's so much evil involved there. You just put a pin in that. But it doesn't matter who was involved in bringing about that nation coming back into its land. What does the Bible say? It says that
Yeah.
so it just doesn't, like, it doesn't matter. And has God used people in the past in scripture? Can we go back through these 66 books and see that God used people that were not
Mhm.
for him to accomplish his purposes? In fact, did God use people
Absolutely.
who were against him completely to accomplish his purposes? Yes. So I don't know why people get so hung up on that. I mean, again, I'm into all of understanding the families and what's going on and all the conspiracies that are real. I get it. I know that stuff, but that stuff doesn't trip me up at all, because I just don't. I mean, it's just an easy explanation for that when you're a believer and you can see scripture all throughout scripture that is how God has done things. He'll do whatever he needs to do to get and accomplish his will to be done, and we're seeing that play out in history as we sit now. So,
Yeah.
um,
Well,
okay. So you mentioned, you and I kind of talked offline briefly about this too, but there was something. So we get a lot of pushbacks from preterists too, on this, and so I know you were kind of briefly going over that. Like, if it is clear Revelation was written in 95 AD, which obviously it completely shatters that paradigm that Revelation was written about 70 AD. But I know we talked about how that came to be through a Jesuit priest, back in the 16th century, and you were talking about that as well. So I would love for you to shed some light on that.
yeah. So when we go back to Martin Luther in 1517, again, he wasn't trying to revolt against the Catholic Church. He was trying to reform it. But in that process, he got excommunicated, kicked out.
Hmm.
That triggers the Protestant Reformation. So about 100 years later, maybe not even 100 years later, the Roman Catholics, by this point, there's a great division within Christendom between Roman Catholic Church and then everybody else that claims to be Christian. Whether
Hmm.
you're Episcopalian, Lutheran, Anabaptist, whatever, you're not part of the Catholic Church, so you're outside of the Catholic Church. And when the early Protestant reformers broke away from the Catholic Church, they did some good things. They began to codify certain ideas like the five solas,
Hmm.
salvation by grace through faith alone, in Christ alone, in Scripture alone, glory to God alone, and I can't remember the last one, but um, those are things that became codified during this time period. And one of the things that didn't get changed when they broke away from the Catholic Church was the eschatology, this idea of
Exactly.
amillennialism,
Yes.
that they were the kingdom and that Christ is ruling
Right
now through the
now.
church. He's
Hmm.
ruling in heaven, and then they need somebody on the earth to represent the Christ authority, which became the Bishop of Rome, the papacy.
Hmm.
And in the process of that breaking away from the Catholic Church and all of the anathemas and stuff pronounced and curses and inquisitions and so forth. Um, the idea that the Catholic Church was the beast it became a very popular idea,
Yep.
or at least at the very minimum, the false prophet. And so the
Hmm.
system of the Roman Catholic Church became villainized. So by the end of the 1500s, there was a Jesuit priest named Louis Alcazar who was a Jesuit priest. He's part of the Counter Reformation. So the idea to bring all of these rogue Protestant groups back under the wing of Catholic, the Mother Church, if you will.
Hmm.
And he wrote in his book, "The Investigation of the Hidden Sense of the Apocalypse." And this is where he begins to shift blame away from the Roman Catholic Church and saying that all that prophecy was done in the past. It was done by the pagan Romans prior to 70 AD, and they try and cram all the revelation back into that time period. So there were several well-known Protestants that bought into that view, and eventually it took a few hundred years for it to kind of gain any kind of traction in the Protestant side, but eventually it would.
Mm-hmm.
and it's kind of come and gone over the last 150 years. But
Picked up
basically, you
some
have
steam.
A full preterist says that everything to include the second coming has already happened prior to
Yes.
70 AD, and so
Yep.
there's nothing in the Book of Revelation that's future. And
Mm-hmm.
then I would say, most preterists today are what we call partial preterist,
Partial.
where they would
Mm-hmm.
say that everything up into the second coming of Christ has happened in the Book of Revelation. That's already happened in the past. And so R.C. Sproul and some of these others have
Yep.
popularized that position. I would argue that in order to hold either view, you would have to do these Olympic sized cheetah flips, mental cheetah flips, to try and fit the things in Revelation into some period in the first century.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly, the destruction of Jerusalem, the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD was a bad thing, but it wasn't the worst thing that ever happened to the Jewish people.
Right.
Argue just by numbers,
Right.
the Holocaust eclipses
Mm-hmm.
that, by every metric you can think of.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, the oceans turning to blood, and all the mountains leveling out and sinking into the sea, and all the other things that are described in the Book of Revelation, we can't make those fit into history unless we do serious uh, allegorizations and damage to the actual, just what does the text say. We're having to make all sorts of personal interpretations into these
Yeah.
things, and so historicism is a view, I think, that kind of blends in with that, and where they try to make the events in Revelation, the future events, fit into some kind of historical past event.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, and this is just a poor example, but if I could say that if I'm a historicist and I lean into the preterist kind of perspective, even as a partial preterist, I can make the case that Obama was the coming of the Antichrist. I can shape the Bible to point to all these verses that seem to allude to this idea that he's the Antichrist. And that's not what our job is to do. We're not supposed to eisegete or
Eisegesis.
put
Yeah.
into the
Mm-hmm.
text
Yep.
our own opinion. We're supposed to take out of it what it says. And
Yes.
that's the exegesis of that's what we're supposed to be doing.
Mm-hmm.
So I can't in all honesty and good conscience try and make the case that the trumpet judgments happened back in the 1300s, with the bubonic plague, or some other thing. It stretches credulity to try and fit those things into past events, which means that it's not, in my understanding at all, it's not a biblical view at all.
Mm-mm.
Um,
I think
and
they really
somebody,
have a hard time of like looking at what's going on right now. Like, what do you do with it? Like, other than to
yeah,
ignore it, what do you do with it? And I mean, I can remember even reading different things and hearing different conversations about how, even going back to before Israel became a nation, there were books being written that Israel would come back into existence, and those people that wrote those books were called crazy, and yet it happened.
yeah, yeah.
But the point is that if you take that view, then nothing that's going on right now is of any relevance to God's plan at all. Really, it's just happening. Like, I've heard people say, yeah, because the politics can shift, you know the things that are on the world stage can shift, and that's okay. That's fair. But what we have seen take place in the last 4 years is truly unprecedented, and it's not just because we have technology and everybody's got a social media account. Yeah, that stuff comes into play. We get information thrown at us a lot faster. But the events themselves, the convergence is the word I'm looking for. The convergence of events that are happening, that the Bible is so clear would be coming into play prior to the snatching away of the church. I mean, wow, it leaps off the pages if you go into it with an open mind of, again, just taking the text at face value.
And so it's really it's a satanic strategy
Yes.
to have divided the church over these last 2,000 years over primary doctrine, secondary doctrine,
Mm-hmm.
tertiary doctrine. So the church is now more divided than it's
Yeah.
ever been in its entire existence,
Mm-hmm.
which, in my view, lines up with the seven churches chronicling the church ages. I know not
Absolutely.
everybody believes that. Not even every dispensationalist
Yeah.
believes that.
Mm-hmm.
This is something that I've kind of leaned on, but it is a belief that the churches in the early church also adopted these ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but now, granted, it's much harder for them to see that play out as they're living through it. It's much easier when you're in hindsight looking back and you can see these periods of time when a certain aspect of Christendom becomes dominant, like the dominant form of Christianity on the face of the planet. Like during the Dark Ages, the
Mm-hmm.
Catholic Church became the dominant face of Christendom across the world. You didn't really associate when you associated Christianity, you thought of Rome,
Mm-hmm.
Templar Knights, that kind of that whole mess there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Groups like the Walden, I can't ever say their name right, the Waldensians, the Anabaptists, and other groups that um, were basically very small sects compared to the overwhelming Roman Catholic system that was in place up until the Protestant Reformation. So we could look back in time and see how that those fit those seven churches,
Mm-hmm.
and then not only those seven churches that Jesus wrote to, but the seven churches that Paul wrote to can also be overlaid on top of those, and then the seven of the eight mystery kingdom parables can be laid on top of those as well. So I find it's sad, when we think about what the church could have accomplished had we not deviated into so many different been fractured
I
into
know.
so many different views on things, not just
Mm-hmm.
eschatology, but on baptism, on communion,
Mm-hmm.
on predestination. I mean, you can think of whatever topic, and it's
Oh, I
been
know.
argued 16 different ways from
Yeah,
Sunday. So
agreed.
that's part and parcel a tactic of Satan to keep the true church divided on all these issues.
Mm-hmm.
And if people want to make the argument that pre-tribulation is new, well, let's take that argument at their face value and say, well, let's do the research. Let's go back and look. And when you go back and look and show them that this view has been around for a very long time, in fact, as long as the New Testament's been around, they
Yep.
don't want to hear it. They don't want to
I
hear the
know.
evidence anymore. They
No,
just
they
kind of
don't.
shut their minds and
Yeah.
they move on to something else.
I find that it's a circular argument. I get the John Darby created the rapture. Nope. I can go back to the Bible because the Bible's ultimate authority anyway. I can give you scripture, then we can even talk about the church fathers, and then so I can show them that, and then they'll say, or I can say, oh, that the early church fathers, actually had a lot to say about pre-tribulationalism. Well, it's not in the Bible. Nope, that's not true. I give you information on that, and then we're back to, well, John Darby created the rapture. It's just like this giant wheel they don't
Yeah.
want to get I'm like, okay, obviously you don't have any desire to look into this for yourself, and if you don't, that's where you're stuck at. Okay, I'm going to be getting a crown for looking for the fact that Jesus is returning and you're not, and that's okay. Like, that's where we're at. That's what the word says. Like, we have a crown coming to us because we're excited and watchful, and nobody's going to steal that joy from me. I'm watching it all take place right outside my window, and I can see that the time is soon. So
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah. So, okay. So, as we kind of start to move into our second topic here, I think this is kind of a cool segue, but there is this video that you did on YouTube with Brother Tyler from Generation 2434, and I have this video saved. I've watched it so many times because it was just such a fascinating presentation of this window of time that y'all kind of laid out 2023, 24, 25, and 26 for that rapture timeline, and talking about the 6,000 years and how we're coming to the end of that based on 33 AD. And I would love it if you would talk a little bit about that today, because here we are, we're rounding the corner on where we at, July, almost August. So we're rounding close to getting into the fourth quarter here of 2024. And we've seen stuff ramp up so much since y'all did that video in 2023. And I just remember watching that video and thinking, wow, it was just awesome to hear, to see the information you guys gave and just the presentation of it. And now that we are seeing, I mean, things are wild right now. So we're coming up on so much here just in our country
Mhm.
alone over the next several months. So I would love for you to talk about that a little bit and give some insight if people have not actually seen that, which I'll link that original video for people down in the description box for them to see. But give some info on that topic and that whole idea of this final four.
Okay. Well, the kind of the preface for this is that I've always kind of held to this view. I don't want to say always, but since I've had my come to Jesus moment back in 2007
Mm-hmm.
and really began digging back into the Bible and all things Bible prophecy and apologetics and all the other things I was brought back into. I read an article from Don Koenig from his website, The Prophetic Years, and this came out in 2007. I think I read it in 2009, and he took every major um, prophecy that had any kind of timestamp associated with it and basically made a table and then began a weighted table where he began to look at the pros and cons and et cetera, et cetera. So he had come up with at the medium of all of these together that there would be a time frame somewhere between the mid 2020s to the mid 2040s as
Mm-hmm.
being at the far end, the second coming, and then you would back that up a number of years for the start of the tribulation,
Mm-hmm.
and then the rapture is not even in view in this. So we're not looking at the
Right.
rapture. We're simply looking at the 70th week of Daniel
Yep.
and then the second coming, because those are things that can be known. Once they start, you can know with relative certainty that, it's going to be right at the 7 year mark.
Yeah.
And so I've always held to the view that it would be somewhere at least in the mid 2020s up to like the mid 2030s for everything to be wrapped up. So that the action that we would see from the prophetic standpoint would take place in the 2020s. Now, that wasn't a very popular position to take in 2009.
I
Obvi-
bet not.
yeah.
And
So
I bet you were like,
obvious.
dang.
Yeah. So I mean, of course, I wanted the rapture to happen way back then, but
Right.
in my heart of hearts, I kind of knew that this was going to be still a ways off.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I've written about this in other articles and presentations, like running out of normal and
Yes.
some other ones. But
I'll link those too.
The argument that I could make in 2009 versus 2000 or say 1990, if I were watching and waiting for the Lord, what were the things holding me back in 1990 that are no longer holding me back in understanding in 2009? There were still things that didn't make any sense, and I didn't see how we got from point A to point B on those things. So Don, who again arguably presents this idea that we're still several decades away from any of this stuff taking place, again, was not popular. but
Right.
it made sense to me, and it resonated with me in a way that I thought, okay, well, this makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so all the different hype periods that have come and gone, I've kind of like, okay, yeah, I'm not really looking. I look at these things kind of observationally, but I'm not like all in with like the Mayan calendar 2012 thing or like any of the other type of fads that have come and
Oh
gone.
yeah, right.
And we know what those are because they get hyped up really really big until they come and go, and then people kind of forget about them. But
Mm-hmm.
so this idea of the mid 20s is something I've held to for a lot longer. It's not something that I developed in the 2020s. It's something I've believed in since the 2009 period. I want to get that point across because um, I just want to make sure people aren't thinking this is a Johnny come lately. I'm jumping on this bandwagon. This is something I've held
Yeah.
to for and written about for a very long time.
Yes.
And secondly, this idea that God, we take these two passages primarily from Psalm 90:10 and then Second Peter. Um, I'm blanking on the actual verse itself, but it talks about the day is as 1,000 years, and it's like Second Peter 3 something.
Yep.
Um, I think maybe like Second Peter 3:11 or something, where it talks about that the a day is as 1,000 years. So if we take that principle in Psalm 90:10 and the one there in Second Peter 3,
Mm-hmm.
and we apply that to the passage in Hosea, it presents an interesting position if we take those things together, right?
Do you want me to read that
Hosea,
passage in Second Peter?
yeah, I can read it. It's in
Okay.
five. I started in 5:15. So Hosea 5:15 says,
Yep.
"I will return again to my place till they acknowledge their offense. Then they will seek my face. In their affliction they will earnestly seek me. Come and let us return to the Lord, for he is torn, but he will heal us. He is stricken, but he will bind us up. After 2 days he will revive us. On the third day he will raise us up, that we may live in his sight. Now, if the principle that Peter and David lay out in their idea of God's reckoning with time, that a day is as 1,000 years, 1,000 years is as a day, what that ultimately means is that God's not bound by time, right?
Bound
He
by
is
time,
not.
right?
He
Yep.
created time for us. He is
Yep.
not. It's not something that he is
He already
confined
sees
to
it
himself,
all laid out. Yeah.
right?
Yep.
And if every jot and tittle in scripture means something and it's not just there arbitrarily, then I have to think that the usage of this after 2 days, and on the third day means something more than just kind of poetical, fanciful writing, that there is intention behind why it says that.
Mhm.
um, we have to look at, okay, well, what does that mean 2 days? If that means 2,000 years, it may not mean exactly 2,000 years, but we get a rough idea that this is a period of time. And I also kind of preface all of this to say that God in the past, if he's consistent with what he's done in the past, if that's consistent with what he will do in the future, then it should be right around the 2,000th year mark. So from
Mhm.
Adam to Abraham is 2,000 years, roughly. Abraham to Jesus is roughly 2,000 years to his first
Mhm.
coming. And it makes sense that from Jesus' first coming to his second coming would again be around 2,000 years. And ultimately, this would all be wrapped up and concluded at the second coming, which will then usher in the seventh day or the 7,000th year, which is a day of rest. And this will be the millennial kingdom where Christ is ruling and reigning from the earth, from Jerusalem, the throne of David. People don't learn war anymore. They beat their swords into plowshares. The
Mhm.
lion lies down with the wolf, and the child can play near the cobra's den, and no one harms or hurts and on his holy mountain, and all of that. Like all of the passages that we see in the Old Testament regarding the kingdom age, that this would be the time when that happens.
Yep.
So now, neither Tyler nor myself are saying specifically that the rapture has to
Oh
happen during
no.
this time period.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no,
but
not at all. Not at all. Yeah, we don't
we
date
we
set,
make that
folks. Yeah.
we make that pretty clear in the video.
Yeah.
We're not saying that the rapture has to happen. I mean, we could
Yeah.
go into 2028 and the rapture's not happened yet.
Right.
So we're
Yeah.
saying, from Tyler and my perspective, is that this is the time when it looks very interesting to us. If things hold true, pattern holds true, right? Then this
Right.
should be. I hate using the term high watch time because I think any time can be a high watch time, but
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah,
it's it's of
every day is a high
it's
watch
it's
day.
interesting. It's interesting to see all of the convergence happening during
Yes.
these 4 years.
Yes.
Now that we see Trump didn't get a second term, now he's going to have to run again, and he's going to run again in a non-consecutive term, which I think the only other president that's happened to, and correct me if I'm mistaken, I think it was like Grover Cleveland or somebody like in the
Yeah.
1800s. They had two non-consecutive
Mm.
terms, but now here Trump looks like he's poised to take a second term, despite all of the things thrown against him, despite all of the lawsuits and the lawfare and the impeachments and the assassination attempt now, and everything else. He's still trucking along, and he looks like he's on schedule to reclaim the presidency. Now, this isn't in that brief, but this is just something I find curious, that in the King James version of the Bible, at least, we see that in 1 Corinthians 15, that the word says in the last trump, instead of the last trumpet or the last, whatever. It says at the last trump that basically the rapture is going to happen. Now, for every generation prior to ours, no one would have associated that with a presidency of anybody, even Donald Trump, because for the longest time, nobody ever thought he would run as president. But the fact that now he looks like he's poised to take a second term in this little window of time that we have. And I'm not saying that Donald Trump is he's not uh, prophetic in that sense, but you're right. God can use Gentile rulers and leaders to accomplish His own purpose, and He's used the pharaohs, He's used Nebuchadnezzar, He's used Artaxerxes, He's used Pontius Pilate, He's used all sorts of Gentile leaders throughout time to accomplish His will and what He wants done. And I just think it would be divinely ironic if the rapture did occur during Trump's second term, because it would be the
So
last. Trump presidency.
Okay, so I put out a video earlier this week. Actually, I was kind of going through some of his stuff with his speech at the RNC, and he used a term that talks about the golden age, which is all related to New Age philosophy, New Age belief. And so, from the lens that I've come from, studying like what these people want to do in 2025, they believe that there's going to be a massive disappearance of people, but they, it's a complete inversion of what we believe. I actually have, and I didn't get here overnight, by the way, nor was this an original thought. It was just through lots of watching and researching and, putting things together. But I feel like I think the idea is for him to win. I think that's the selection. I really do. And I know, I believe in a selection, but I think that he is coming at it from a light world order because everybody is rejecting this Klaus Schwab, this Yuval Noah Harari. Like everyone is rejecting that vehemently. They're like, no, we're not doing that. Everyone is seeing the open satanic things, the obvious dark things, the devil with the red horns. Everybody sees that. But there are a lot of things policy wise that he believes in that are the exact same things as the dark side, but they're just different terminology. It's worded differently. So I think that he might be used in that manner because I feel like people will fall for that hook, line, and sinker. He was talking so much about the AI technology and Elon Musk is really behind him. And we all know, Elon is very tied to, the satanic side of things, his wife, all of that. He does the Freemasonic signs, like he does all the things. So it's just interesting to me because I feel like because everyone is rejecting this obvious, you were on JB's show this past week. You've been on everybody's show this past week, which is awesome. But everyone is rejecting that dark side, but there are some really awful things that go on in that dark side. And you and JB talked a lot about that this week on his show. But it's almost like that because people are rejecting that, it's going to have to come about in a way that people will accept it and that it kind of goes under the radar. And when I've done the digging into those terminologies, the golden age, the age of Aquarius, like all of that, that's kind of why I brought that forward because I thought it was just very interesting that he used that term, that's his goal is to usher in a new golden age. So it was very curious to me. Very just, so that's kind of where I'm at with it.
Yeah, I'm not going to ascribe any type of Messiah-like attributes
Oh,
to Donald Trump,
I know. Oh, right.
nor do I think that he is going to make America great again or anything. Nothing's going to happen to this nation beyond or outside of what God has already predetermined for her role to play in the last days. So,
Mm-hmm.
um, in fact, Lee Brainerd and I are going to we're doing a discussion on why the left, the political left and the political right hate the pre-tribulation rapture view because
That's awesome.
you have detractors on both sides
Yes.
that basically look at the pre-trib view as, we're too busy, with our heads, stuck in the clouds and we're no good here on the earth, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to discuss that because I
That's
think there
tonight.
is a lot of, yeah, there's
Okay.
going to be a lot
Okay.
of confusion over um, what is a Christian's uh, role to play here in these last final days, where you've got a
Right.
revival of patriotism and nationalism that a
Yeah.
lot of folks are even using to augment their Christian
I
eschatology on
know.
things. And
I know.
this is where groups like the post-trib position, the pre-wrath position, preterist, um, amillennialist, post-trib, post-millennialist, etc., really begin to rise up because now this is speaking their language of overcoming worldly evil through the
Mm-hmm.
church and enduring. And so they're taking bits and pieces of the Bible and they're
Mm-hmm.
trying to fit it into this kind of pro-American nationalism.
Yep.
And I'm a patriot. Like
I know.
I served my country for 22 years.
I
I don't
know you
regret
have.
any of my time there. I
Mm-hmm.
don't if I had my druthers, I'll vote for Trump because I'm not looking at it as from a political standpoint. I'm
It's
looking at it from a
policy for
policy
you.
standpoint.
I know.
Who
Yeah.
whose policies do I want to live under? Do I want to live under one that's openly hostile to Christianity, or do I want to live under one that tolerates Christianity, but it's not everything I want it to be?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the case you're making is this false dichotomy that's being presented, much the same way that we see with like Harry Potter or whatever,
Yes.
where there's good magic and bad magic,
Yeah,
but they're both
exactly that.
from the same source,
Yes, exactly that.
Uh,
Exactly that. Yes. And that's the thing. It's just an interesting viewpoint to kind of just step back and go, is that what's going on right now? And I even mentioned that in my video. Like, I'm not going to sit here and deny and say, like, my life was far better 4 years ago. It was easier to buy groceries, put gas in the car. I didn't need a second job like what I have right now to help income wise. Like, it's all the things. But it is wild to see such a, Pete, it's almost like we're seeing just like a big clash between both of those dynamics, light world order and dark world order. It's like they're, you know what I mean? But the
yeah,
outcome is still the same, is the point. That's what I was trying to make the point on the video. Like, we're still going to reach the point where the church is going to be raptured and we're out of here. And then, God's wrath is going to be poured out through the tribulation. And the thing that's interesting to me is that in Matthew 24, and I realize, that's predominantly a Jewish passage, but it does talk about how before Jesus returns, people are going to be, drinking and getting married and all of these things. I don't think that's going to exist in the tribulation when people are literally running for their life and hiding in caves, like, and trying to survive. I just don't see that. I see that as like the timeline of like, this is when Christ will return to get his church to bring us out. So there's just lots of different, we can call them rabbit holes if you want. There's lots of different trails we could go down on that. But this idea about the final four was so interesting to me when I heard this from you guys, because I had been looking into what the occult wants to do, like what's their primary goal. And 2025 is a big year for these guys. There's a lot of things that they are pushing. Project Bluebeam is another one that's got some very interesting things that they're trying to do with Project Bluebeam in 2025. I was just mentioning that, it's just the idea behind what the inverse of what we believe wants to do in 2025 is just wild. It's really just super wild to see some of this stuff coming into play. And I think we're seeing just a very big division in a lot of different places right now, whether that, is the church, all these issues coming up in the churches that are, going woke and going broke, because people are leaving them in droves, and then there are people flocking to them. So it's really an interesting time. So you and Tyler were talking about this final four. The concept of this was taking that, whether Jesus was crucified in 30, 31, 32, or 33, and that's the main years that people kind of debate over. And you and I both agree that it was 33. If we take that at face value and we fast forward 2,000 years from 33 AD to 2033, then we back that up 7 years. And it was just interesting how you guys put all that together, which is why I said I would link the video.
yeah. So for me, the 4-year window, if you look at the top of it, I don't know if you have a way to show it, but
Let me
I have
see.
in there the 2,000 years / 2 days, and then I've got some associated scripture passages with it. But I call the first generation there from 33 AD all the way up until 1948 as the cutoff generation. So it's 1950 years basically, from when the Jews rejected Jesus and he was
Yes.
ultimately crucified. So we go to Matthew 27:25. Note here what they yell as they're yelling to Pontius Pilate, and they said, "And all of the people answered and said, His blood be on us and on our children." Now, in other passages, I think in Luke 19, where Christ is coming in to Jerusalem at the Palm Sunday, what we call Palm Sunday, and he weeps over the city because he says, your town's going to be overthrown, your
Mm-hmm.
kids are going to be killed, and basically just talking about the destruction that was going to happen to them in 70 AD. Though there was a 40-year gap roughly
Yes.
between that and when it actually takes place. But I consider that the cutoff generation, and so it wasn't until 1948 that we see basically the Valley of Dry Bones come back together and stand up as a nation. Now they don't have breath in them; they don't have that Spirit of God in them yet because they're not back into that covenant relationship with the Lord as a nation, not individually. But we see that as being kind of the fig tree generation, and I don't know. I'm not going to be foolish enough to try and pinpoint um, and say that it has to be right at 70 years. We're already at
Oh,
75
yeah.
years since
Right.
1948. It could be 80 years. We really don't know. Jesus could have been just making a general statement about the trees. When you begin to see them bloom or whatever, that summer's near. You could also, I guess, you could also look at the Luke's version in the Olivet Discourse where he says all the trees, as being the representative of the nations that would rise up around Israel, because I think it's in Judges 9, there's a parable of the trees, and the trees are referred to as like nations, as countries. And
Mhm.
so it's not without, what I mean by that is it's not without precedence to look at the trees as being countries, because we see it in the Old Testament. Um, but the fig tree generation from 1948 to 2023, at least when this started, was right at 75 years. And so from 2023 to 2033, there's a 10-year period of time.
Mhm.
So if the Lord comes back, and this is a giant if,
Yep.
the Lord's second coming is on or around 2033, and we know that 7 years has to happen before that. We were just looking at, okay, how does that fit into this? And we've ended up coming up with a window of time, because there's debate over whether the Lord was crucified in 30 or 31 or
30,
32
right.
or 33, and we don't know specifically. There's good arguments all the way around.
Mhm.
Um, Now, all that to say, we have what Scripture points to, which I've indicated in the diagram. We also know what the world wants to do, because
Yes.
there's all of this talk about the Great Reset happening in 2030.
Yep.
United Nations has the Agenda 2030, and they're trying to speed this up through various crises,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
other machinations to make global government a reality.
Mhm.
When for so long it has only been a dream, by dictators,
Right.
Hitler and his thousand-year Reich, and probably Stalin and Lenin and these other guys that thought communism would take over the world. And
Yeah.
all of this stuff is to say that we're looking at this convergence of all these different things from both the secular side and from the biblical side starting to come together, and it seems like we're in this season of the Lord's return.
Mhm.
Although we can't know specifically the day or the hour, we have a general understanding of the season. And I
Mhm.
think we see that reiterated in First Thessalonians 5, 1-4, Hebrews 11 or 10, Hebrews 10:25, and then Revelation 3:3, where Christ is um, chastising the church of Sardis, saying that if they don't watch, he's gonna come upon them as a thief, and they're
As a
not gonna
thief,
know
yeah.
when his
Mhm.
time comes.
Yep.
And I think we see that if Sardis represents kind of the mainstream Protestant side of Christendom, um, certainly most of those churches now do not teach a premillennial perspective. They teach a
Mhm.
amillennial or
Mhm.
postmillennial or
Mhm.
preterist viewpoint of the Lord's return. And I would say that the both the mainstream Protestant side as well as the Roman Catholic side do not overwhelmingly do reject a premillennial position. So they
Yeah, and
don't
they can't
accept
those
that
don't
as
coexist. Yeah, they can't coexist. It doesn't work. You either, premillennialism says one thing and amillennialism says another. They don't and same with postmillennial. You can't be yeah, those don't work. They don't mesh together. So that's what I
yeah.
keep trying to get people to understand. Like we can disagree about the timing of the rapture, but why don't all of us who actually believe in the premillennial view just kind of like band together and help people understand this is the time that we are going into? Because that's obvious. So, but
Yeah, and I would say that that's probably um all of us are culpable in spreading that divisiveness over the last 30, 40 years,
sure.
um, where premillennialism is so fractured now that you can't really get folks together, because so people are so polarized on their particular positions. Now I'll make
Mhm.
exceptions, and I like guys like John Haller
Yeah.
who leans pre-wrath, but
Mhm.
he's not dogmatic about being pre-wrath.
Yep.
Whereas somebody like me, I'm dogmatically pre-trib.
I know, same.
And in all earnestly, like in all, I mean, in all sincerity, like I don't care what position a person holds.
Right, yeah.
That's between them and God. But if we want to have an honest discussion or an academic discussion about it, let's do that. and let's let the chips fall where they may. And if the pre-trib position is the most biblically sound position because it complements and does not conflict with any other doctrinal position within Christendom, then I think whichever doctrine goes forward as far as eschatological positions, that should be the one that most people should accept. But they won't accept it. They won't even look at the evidence
I know.
because it conflicts with either the church they grew up in, or it
Mm-hmm.
conflicts with some teacher they like, or
Mm-hmm.
maybe they've already got their bunker built and all the beanie weenies stored up, and they don't want to like think that that's a wasted investment. Like whatever the
Yeah.
case is,
Right.
people just don't. You can show them the truth, you can show them the evidence, and you
Yep.
can't make them accept it because
Yeah.
the human mind is just complicated like that. But here's for me for the 4-year window thing.
Yeah.
Um,
Put a
we
bow around
said
it.
if 2033 is the year that the second coming happens, this is again a giant if.
Yeah.
If
Right.
2033 is the year that he returns at the second coming, then all of the rapture has to be sometime in the 2020s.
Yes.
And if we look at the rapture, we won't know the day or the hour of the rapture, but we can look at the conditions necessary for the 70th week of Daniel, the 7-year tribulation to happen.
Mm-hmm.
We're already there in terms of technology, in terms of the geopolitical confluence that wants to rush towards a global government. We're
Yep.
there with a digital currency. We're there with
Yeah.
global mass communications, military weapons of war. All of that stuff is already set in place. And like
It is.
these are things that if we were to transplant ourselves from today back to 1990, we couldn't even make the case for hardly any of those things because we wouldn't have any understanding of the internet or
Mm-mm.
a very basic understanding of what the internet was, first of all.
Yep.
But secondly, we couldn't even imagine all of the smart devices and Bluetooth and everything else that's not connected physically to something. Because you remember for the first, I don't know, 10, 15 years, I mean, I had to physically plug into the wall to get to the internet. It had to,
That
the idea of
lovely
Bluetooth was,
sound. Yes. Yeah, the dial up. My parents would be like, "Hey, you can't get on the phone between these hours and these hours. We're running our business." Like that's how it was. Like we just didn't have a phone at that time because everything was through the yeah.
and in fact, I would say there's almost no devices in my house with the exception of the router that's connected physically to the internet. Everything else is Bluetooth.
I know. Yeah.
And that just shows the progression of how things have moved since
Mhm.
even just within 30 years, how fast things have progressed, and they're going to continue to progress um, exponentially so until we're caught out of here. So how much
Mhm.
further do we have to press on between now and the rapture? We don't know.
Nope.
Um, I like my hypothesis that it's during Trump's second term, and so it
I
kind of
know.
tongue in cheek would be in the last Trump, but
Yeah. Yep, I know, and I that's the funny thing. I really thought like I hoped it would be, by now already, but it's been awesome to still be around to in this time because I've seen friends of mine come to the Lord that, it's emotional seeing that because um they're seeing the craziness going on and understanding that there is a true cosmic battle between Satan and Jesus, and they see it. And all of this craziness brought them to Jesus. And that's so neat. So I feel like 2025 is going to be a very interesting year. But I still feel like, again, we believe in imminency. So it could happen, it could happen while we're recording this. But um I think that the interesting part for me is I used to think there was this giant gap between the time that the rapture happened and when the tribulation was to start. And I've had to alter that because we're seeing so much foreshadow and so much setup of all the things that will happen within that final 7 years. And I think it's plausible. Like if we don't see the rapture happen soon, we could be living under some of that globalization. I mean, it's good. I believe it'll go regional before it goes global, right? Trump wants the digital dollar, I believe, so he's going to be still pushing cashless society and pushing that digitized system. Blockchain is going to be one of the ways that he's really interested in doing it. So all of those things still accomplish the same outcome. So I think 2025 is going to be really interesting. And again, just because the occultists and all of that, all of their, their books and stuff say whatever, it doesn't mean that that's going to happen. It's just the point that they are really honed in and focused in on that time frame. And then you have when you tie in the World Economic Forum and you tie in, um, oh goodness, yeah, the World Economic Forum and just their goals for Agenda 2030. I mean, it's all of these things culminating at the exact same time frame, along with us
Yeah.
saying, "Hey, this is what the world's going to look like when Jesus comes back for us, and it's going to get really bad, and you're going to see all these things come into play." And people are like, "Whoa, maybe there's something there to that." So that's what I think is fascinating about it. And just like you said, you were like in 2009 looking at this time frame based on things that you were learning back then, and I know that had to be heartbreaking for you. But just the fact that here we are, I mean, I'm sure at that time that probably looked like an eternity to you, but here we are, so
Yeah. Yeah. It seemed when I was thinking this back then, I was thinking, oh man, that's like a lifetime away. I couldn't even fathom being here in 2024, much less what the world would look like in
I know.
2024.
Yeah.
Um, and that's part of the tyranny of the present. Like we're just confined to the
Mhm.
technology of our day
Yep.
and the history of our day. We can't. It's hard for us to fathom somebody like Trump winning the presidency and then he turn around and recognizing Jerusalem as the eternal capital right on the 70th
Yeah.
anniversary of
Yep.
all of that. So
I know.
my point is, things continue to become exponentially weirder and weirder, but it's weirder and weirder as that convergence becomes more and more recognizable.
Mhm.
And like you said, uh, whether Trump's in or not in, I think that the world is going to continue to press forward toward this
Mhm.
beast kingdom because it
Yes.
says it's going to happen that way. So
That's
no
it.
matter who's in the
It
office,
doesn't matter.
the
Yeah.
world's going to move in that direction. But if I had my druthers and I had to live under one system or the other, like,
Oh, I hear
is
you.
my grocery bill I'm simply looking at this from a pragmatic standpoint. I would
Mhm.
rather live under a Trump economy than a Biden economy or
Oh,
Harris or
yeah.
Obama or
Oh,
whoever.
oh, yeah. I
And
told
and
Go ahead. Yeah,
yeah,
you're good.
and just the reality of having to live in this world. Now, the big argument like you mentioned early on, we get accused of being escapists, and I love people that make that argument to me, that are sitting here in the United States or they're sitting in the West somewhere comfortably behind a computer screen in their house that they live in and
Keyboard
they have food
commander.
and so I'm like, what? Why? If you're so you know ready to die for your faith, why aren't you in North Korea right now? If this is
Right.
such a huge component to your either salvation or sanctification, like that you have to be tried and tested. There's places you can go to right now
Mhm.
that you don't have to wait to be persecuted. you know, we've seen the
True.
persecution come in kind of waves here in the United States as America becomes more postmodern and more pagan and
It's true.
etc. But it's certainly alive and well in almost every other country in the world. If you want to go
Mhm.
to those places right now, you can.
Yeah.
Or if you don't want to go, then the accusation of you being an escapist is more, I don't want to be mean about it, but it's more applicable to them right now because
Sure.
they're choosing not to go to those places than
Mhm.
they are to say, well, the whole world is going to be thrust into this time where nobody can escape, and yet
Mhm.
you guys want to be escapists, and when in fact that directly contradicts what Jesus says. He says, pray that you're worthy to be, to escape all of these things that are
N
coming on the earth.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
um, and I've seen enough of the military, even though I retired in
I'm sure.
2020.
Mhm.
I've seen enough of what we can do in the world
Mm.
with the military and with intelligence systems and with AI and all the other
I
things that are
bet.
happening that there's no way. There's no way people are going to be able to hide from what's coming. And that's why when
No.
you read Revelation 13:7, God basically allows the Antichrist to kill every Christian or every tribulation saint that he can get his hands on.
Mhm.
And they're not spared.
No.
And there's going to be a great, great slaughter of
Mhm.
tribulation saints that come out of the 7 year time period. We see them in Revelation 7 standing before the throne with palm branches in their hands, saying, "How much longer? Are you going to allow this to happen?" And so I was like you. I believed in this huge gap in time, But
Hmm.
the further we press on, the smaller that gap is becoming. And
Yeah.
now, I do think there's a little bit of a gap in time,
Yeah.
maybe a year
Same.
or so, but it
Yep.
doesn't need to be what it was before, three
No,
and a
I
half
was
years
thinking
or
3, 4, 5 years. I don't think that anymore. 6 months, a
yeah.
year, maybe it could be 3 months. It could be 2 weeks. I don't know, but I don't think it's that giant gap that I used to think. Based on what we're
And look at all,
seeing now, it
yeah,
can't
and look
be.
at all the arguments that folks are having now. I'm talking about those within the pre-trib camp. What are we discussing now? I mean, we're looking at things that can't be proven one way or the other, like who is Mystery Babylon? Where is
I
Mystery
know.
Babylon?
Yeah.
Who
Uh
is
huh.
the Antichrist? Who is the false prophet? Who are the 10
Hmm.
kings?
Yep.
We're not looking at things like, well, how can two people be seen all over the world and their bodies are lying in the streets of Jerusalem? How can people see? We're not looking, those logistical problems have already worked themselves
They
out through
have.
the
Yeah.
passage of
We're
time.
talking about more complex things now.
Yeah, yeah, no, exactly. We're looking at a lot of more speculative things that we
Yes.
just, again, we're limited by the tyranny of the present. We're limited by what our we can't fathom that a Babylon city, megalopolis or whatever would rise up in the middle of, let's say, Iraq right now because of the geopolitical conditions there. That place is a dumpster fire going off a
It is a
cliff. I mean,
dumpster
it
fire.
is a
Hmm.
nightmare to live over there,
Oh.
much less have this thriving city, state, whatever. And even the idea of that rising up there seems like it would take decades to happen instead of years. So we're limited to our understanding of our day.
Hmm.
Um, and certainly Babylon, whatever the city is, wherever it is, it's going to rise up and become a city of prominence in the last days, and that's where the Antichrist headquarters will be. And how that all fleshes out, we don't know exactly, but we know that it's got to happen because the Bible says it has to happen.
Yep.
So now we're arguing over more complicated things that happen further into the tribulation
Yeah.
rather than the basics. I think most people have a good handle on the basics,
Yep.
and
I think those conversations are interesting because it's a lot of conjecture. You can't really speculation, of course, and some people do have very good arguments on both sides. Those are very interesting conversations about Babylon and all of that. But you're right. It's because we have fleshed out all of the other things, and we're seeing so much it's just it's like the things that we used to talk about. They're not relevant anymore because they are fleshed out. So yeah. Well, go ahead.
Just one last point. Well, something
Yeah.
that I
Go for
said
it.
early on about their early church, the first 3 centuries of the church was
Yep.
their view on imminence,
Yes.
and certainly in hindsight, um, while imminence is applicable to every generation moving forward, as we are here now, kind of at the end, we're looking backwards. We're saying, well, clearly it could not. The rapture couldn't have been imminent because the church Israel hadn't become a nation again yet, but none of those generations prior to Israel becoming a nation again understood or knew when Israel would become a nation again. Even some of the early dispensational writers that I like a lot, Blackstone, blank on this guy's name here, Clarence Larkin,
Hmm.
who his book, the great book of the world's greatest book of dispensationalism, copyright 1919, said Israel was going to become a nation again. So he called that good
Yep.
26 years before it happened.
I'm sure he was called
Um,
crazy too.
yeah, 28, 29 years before it happened.
Hmm.
Um, he we they could see it happening because the Bible said it was going to happen. How exactly was it going to happen? They weren't sure on. They didn't give any of the
Yeah.
specifics, like it's going to happen in this year in 1948 after another great world. Like they didn't get into that specifics. They only said that, hey, the Bible says Israel's going to become a nation again, so I believe they're going to become a nation again.
Hmm.
And so there's been not just dispensationalists, but other evangelical Christians that took the Bible seriously that said, well, Israel's got to become a nation again. And then that's when the last days will come.
Hmm.
And so here we are now, 70 plus years into the Israel being a nation again. And I've been looking recently at the gap in time between Christ's crucifixion and the destruction of Jerusalem, whether
Hmm.
you want to call that 40 years or 37 years or whatever, depending on when you see the
When you see it,
crucifixion.
yeah. Hmm.
Um, there was an overlap between national Israel coinciding at the same time as the church.
Mm.
And so here we are again since 1948. I don't know if that means it's another 40 years. It's maybe doubled now, 80 years that the church is going to coincide with national Israel at the same time.
Oh, I
It
see the
just seems we're
parallel.
coming to the end
Okay.
of that. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, we're coming to the end of that, whatever that time is, and I'm sure
Yeah.
in God's math it works out perfectly.
Yeah.
I
Of
can't
course
see
it
it
does.
now
No.
from my.
Yeah. Wow. Well, this has been super fun. I love conversations like this where we just kind of get to go back and forth and talk about things and just talk about different views on different aspects of this and just again just reflecting on where we're at in the timeline and just acknowledging like we are here. Like it is just I hear people say all the time, whether they're secular or they're Christian, what a wild time to be alive. I just can't believe I'm seeing all the stuff that I'm seeing. Everybody feels that to their core. So if there's anything else you want to add, if not, we can wrap it up. But do you have anything else you want to touch on before we call it?
Yeah, just one last thing. When Christ
Go for it.
first came, we see in Matthew chapter 1 and 2, um, when the wise men showed up and the Gentile wise men showed up in Jerusalem, they came in this huge entourage and they showed up and King Herod's freaking out. The people of Jerusalem are
Mm-hmm.
freaking out. King Herod calls his wise men, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, and said, "Hey, what are these guys talking about? This one born King of the Jews?" And they kind of
Yep.
downplayed Micah 5:2, and kind of when you read the version that they give in Matthew 2, I think it is, compared to what it actually says in Micah, they completely watered it down to make it sound like it's just going to be some great guy that's going to come instead of God coming in the flesh himself.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't even bother to walk the 5 miles from Jerusalem to Bethlehem to go verify these things for themselves. And I think you can see throughout the rest of Christ's ministry his constant conflicts. The biggest clashes that he has is with the Pharisees and the
Yes.
Sadducees because
Yep.
they refuse to accept who he is, right? And I see that same attitude today when people
Yes.
dismiss all the things pointing to Christ's second coming, and they
I
kind of
know.
just poo-poo it and downplay it like,
Yep.
that doesn't really mean what it says. And
Yep.
people have always been saying it. And I see that same
I know it.
sentimentality with that worldview.
I do too.
And I think it's very dangerous because Jesus, the harshest rebukes he had against anybody in the entire Bible were against those religious people who
Yes.
claim to know it and yet were just whitewashed tombs. They were
Mm-hmm.
clean on the outside, but on the inside they're full of death.
Yep.
And I think that when we talk to folks today that harbor those same sentiments, I'm not saying that they're not saved, and I'm not saying that they're
Yeah.
whitewashed tombs or anything. I'm simply pointing to they're mimicking the
There's a
same
parallel.
attitudes,
Mm-hmm.
paralleling what happened in Christ's first coming,. That they just
Yeah.
kind of like,
Well, and he
So,
even
anyways,
said you can look around and see the weather. But you can't discern the signs of the times. I mean, that was a legitimate question he asked. You just are unaware to be able to discern the signs of the times. So
yeah,
because I mean, people say that. I have had comment after comment. Oh, you guys have been saying this. Jesus is going to come back for over 2,000 years. Yep, we have, and we're going to keep saying it because it's true. And if you can't look around and discern the signs of the times, well, then you're fulfilling Bible prophecy. Congratulations. you know?
yeah.
So
It's that normalcy bias is taking over their minds. I just want to let me close with this reading from the passage here in the chart
go for it.
that I have from Luke 12. I won't read all of it, but I'm going to stop at a certain point because I love the idea that Christ is presenting here.
Go for
He
it.
says, "Let your waist be girded and your lamps burning, so
Mm-hmm.
you're be in a state of readiness, right?
Yes.
And you yourselves be like men who wait for their master when he will return from the wedding, that when he comes and knocks, that they may open to him immediately. Blessed are those servants whom the master, when he comes, will find watching. Assuredly, I say to you that he will gird himself and have them sit down to eat, and he will come and serve them. And if he should come in the second watch or come in the third watch or find them so, blessed are those servants." And I think that the Lord um, loves the idea that his children are watching and waiting for him to
Yes.
return,
Agree.
expectingly and hopefully, in the same way that when a father comes home from a long day's work and he's greeted
Mm.
by children that are run up and give him a hug and love on him and say, we've been waiting for you, versus him coming home and it's just the house is in chaos, everybody's fighting, and like, uh, which, as a father of five, which do I prefer? I love to come home, and now I work from home a lot now, so it's a little different. But like, I love
Yeah.
to come home after a long being away for a long time and greeted by hugs and kisses and people that were waiting for me to come home rather than to come home in this state of chaos.
Yeah.
And so regardless of what anybody tells us, I think that we, in our hearts, we have that expectancy and
Yes.
holding on to the blessed hope of His
Yep.
soon appearing.
Yep.
And I think in that, not only does it give us a sense of peace in a world that's falling apart, but it also it keeps that fire lit daily within us to do the things that God's called us to do. Because now it's not like I'm looking for the Lord to return 500 years from now or
No.
some
Yeah.
undetermined period of time. I know that it could happen today.
Yeah.
And so that's what that living with that imminent mindset um, really has done for me, and that's
I would
definitely kept me on
agree.
my toes.
Yeah, I would agree with that wholeheartedly. I mean, since I really like dug into Bible prophecy in 2020, because that's where everything changed for me. I've been a Christian for a very long time, but I pulled out of the political realm because I used to be a firecracker in the politics side of it. I always made a joke that if you cut me open, I'd bleed red, white, and blue, like all of that. But when 2020 happened and I started seeing the parallel of where the world was going and what the Bible said about where the world would be going before Jesus came back, um, that lit a fire under me that I haven't had in all the years of my life to witness. Because, yes, somebody can die today, they can die today, but there's also that impact of if the rapture happens and you do not know Jesus, because you haven't come to that place in your life where you've accepted that he paid your sin debt, you will be left here to suffer the most awful fate that this world is going to experience. It will be like no other time. It's so bad we can't even comprehend it. So there's something about that creates that urgency in my soul to just tell everybody. And it's never been an easier time to witness. I mean, it's easy to do now because it's everybody's trying to figure out what is going on. How does this impact my life? How are we going to be living? Are we, in America, people are thinking, are we turning into a communist country? But everyone is, around the world collectively is seeing where things are going. And so they're trying to find answers is the point that I'm long-windedly making. Um, but it truly is. We are just in the most amazing time. And I mentioned on when I was chatting with Mondo a couple days ago, I'm so glad to be living in this era versus when Jesus was walking on the earth. I feel like we just have such a privilege to live at this time that and God has called us to be watchmen and, watch women, to be able to say and have a voice that, to blow the shofar, as I like to say, like to tell everybody, because at some point it is going to happen and people are going to hit their knees faster than the speed of light when it's over, when they know, oh, I missed it. I should have listened to Pete. I should have listened to Lauren. I should have listened to Lee. I should have listened. That's what's going to happen. And I know for me, I'm trying to prevent that as much as possible from people that I know and love and don't, people that watch these videos and comment on it. So that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, I think God has allowed this open door of social media to be
Yes.
the medium for with this message to get out in the way that it has.
Mm-hmm.
Like you and I, we can make this video and somebody from the Philippines can watch it, whenever
Exactly.
it's published. Somebody from Norway, somebody from
Yeah.
Ethiopia, somebody
Yeah.
from, all over the world can watch these videos.
Mm-hmm.
And if anything else, people are at least becoming familiar with the concept of the rapture because it's
Mm-hmm.
no longer being taught in churches. Now it's having to go out through these other means. And I consider myself another mean
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
this message would go out
Mm-hmm.
because churches have chosen to remain silent on it. And for
Yeah.
whatever reasons, they do that. But
Yeah.
certainly, I think folks, as soon as it happens, are going to know
Mm-hmm.
instinctively. At least one of their crazy friends will be like, yeah, the rapture this, the rapture that, and they will have at least been familiar with what just happened.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's where that large harvest, that soul harvest, comes out of the beginning parts of the tribulation,
Oh
or from
yeah.
people that were familiar with this idea but then rejected it because they were too busy or they were whatever.
Yeah.
And go on about their daily lives, and then boom, it happens, and the Lord brings them back to this point, like, oh, do you remember that
Mm-hmm.
conversation that Pete was talking about with the
Mm-hmm.
rapture?
Yeah.
And anyways, again, the rapture is not a salvific
No,
doctrine. It doesn't determine whether you're saved or not saved, but it
no, of
does, I
course.
think, have huge implications on your sanctification. This
Yep.
how you walk in the Lord
Absolutely.
is largely shaped by your view of when he comes back. I mean, if you don't
Mm-hmm.
think the Lord's ever coming back, you might just be a normal, decent person, and that's
Yeah.
all fine and dandy.
Yeah. Yeah.
You
You're
might
you're
live your
looking
life
at
and
death. Like, you know what I mean? That's your
you're,
living your
yeah,
life, you
yeah.
die. Yeah, that's yeah, uh-huh.
And there's not necessarily any urgency to what you're doing. And
That's what I mean. Yeah.
secondarily to that, I would say that you're running into the problem that we're having today in American politics, where at least on the conservative side of the house, there's a schism that's growing between those who support Israel and those who
Oh,
simply see Israel's
I
current
know.
situation as a just simply geopolitical. They
Yep.
don't ascribe any type of biblical narrative to it or prophetic narrative. They just simply look
Mhm.
at this as a geopolitical issue that can be
Yes.
solved with carving up this community and doing this and appeasing these
Mhm.
guys and doing,
Yep.
it's all they're trying to work through it, and they're finding that it doesn't work because it's a spiritual issue.
That's it.
And
It
it's
always
something that
has
goes
been.
back.
Mhm.
Yeah. So trying to
Yeah.
put these other fixes on top of a spiritual problem is not going to solve the problem.
Yep.
But that's certainly, again, that'll be something that Lee and I talk about tonight, and why that has
Yes.
largely driven the conservative camp into two camps now, divided the conservatives into two big camps,
Yep.
between those who support Israel because they recognize the prophetic significance with all of this,
Mhm.
and those who don't.
Yep,
And
for sure.
and and they may be the most diehard 100% MAGA pro-Trump folks in the world, but they don't want anything to do with Israel. They equate
Mhm.
Israel with giving money and aid to Israel as the same as giving money and
Yep.
aid to Ukraine, or the same as giving money and aid to this country or that country. It's just no
Mhm.
difference to them because they don't look at the spiritual implications about
Mm-mm.
what the Bible says about the nation of Israel.
For sure.
Um,
And I think a lot of times too, people don't understand there's a very big difference between political Zionism and biblical Zionism. Two very different things. One of the guests I'm having on in a couple of weeks, he and I are going to get into that and how anti-Semitism is rising from that because people don't understand the differences between the two.
yeah,
And
for
that's a
sure.
lot of it. It really is. It's like, because and I see that in comments all the time. I'm like, oh man, they're getting swept up into these terms and they don't even understand what they're saying, you know? So, yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. Well, Pete, oh my goodness, thank you so much for all this time today. This was a lot of fun. I will link all of your websites, your YouTube, any way that that anybody can get in touch with you. And then, of course, with you and Lee filming tonight, by the time this goes out, that video will be done. So I'll link that for people to go watch too. So yeah, I just appreciate you coming on here today and chatting, and I appreciate you having me on your channel before. I enjoy everything that you do. I love all the stuff that you write, the videos you do, and I just want to tell you thank you for everything that you're doing for, the coming kingdom. Awesome.
Yeah, for sure. And once my internet gets up to speed, I'll start bringing guests back on,
Perfect.
and shouldn't have any issues at that point with people dropping
Perfect.
off, or
Yeah.
me dropping me
Right.
dropping
Yeah.
off or whatever. So
Well, oh my goodness, did Pete and I talk about a plethora of things on that interview? It was so much fun. Pete, thank you so much for being so gracious to come on this channel. I always enjoy chatting with you and just learning from you. You just have a plethora of knowledge that you have on every single subject out there, and you're just a pleasure to chat with. And it's just really honestly fun to kind of go through these scenarios with you. And of course, if you have not checked out Pete's resources, don't sleep on those. They're down below in the description box. And if you have not subscribed to this channel, what are you doing with your life? I know that's why you are here. So do that so that you don't miss any future uploads. And as I always say at the end of every single video, keep your eye on the sky and keep your ear listening for that shofar. I'll see you in the next one. Maranatha.